Why aren't rangelands more widely recognized and valued? Why is the rangeland profession so misunderstood? These have been lamentations that have echoed throughout the profession throughout my entire career. Greetings, Symposium's participants. I'm David Briske, professor in the Department of Ecology and Conservation Biology at Texas A&M University in the US. And today I'll be addressing a replacement of the rangeland marginalization narrative with one of planetary value. It turns out that these lamentations have been confirmed by a recent UN-sanctioned report entitled A Case of Benign Neglect. And the report suggests that insufficient evidence suggests to define the scope and extent of rangelands, determine their current status, the future stewardship needs, and what implementation action is required. So if a global rangeland stewardship strategy exists, it's being very poorly implemented. This also is evident in the perceived value of forest versus rangeland. So here is a recent report published by FAO, the Global Forest Reassessment, and it was referencing a baseline data set collected in 1990, and it provides multiple metrics for both national and global forests. A comparable assessment does not exist for rangelands, although the recent Rangeland Atlas is a step in the right direction. Now, this isn't a case of just bruised professional ego. This marginalization narrative has huge costs in terms of biodiversity and associated ecosystem services lost or that become externalities in land use change and land use decisions. These services often go unrecognized or undervalued relative to a few select provisioning services. The list of examples is large, but a couple would be wildlife loss in response to private land tenure in Africa, or loss of key resource areas to agricultural conversion throughout the globe. This also creates opportunities for land acquisition for purposes of resource exploitation, and indigenous peoples are often disadvantaged in those situations. Now, this rangeland marginalization is taking place even though global rangelands are critical to planetary stewardship. Rangelands are some 54% of the total land area, 30% of the terrestrial carbon pool, host tremendous amounts of biodiversity, including charismatic mammals. They possess several cultural heritage sites and diverse pastoral societies, as well as other important values valuable to society. Now, according to Diana Davis, the marginalization narrative can be traced back to European scholars in the mid-19th century, where they misinterpreted rangelands as degraded forests due to mismanagement by indigenous pastoralists. This narrative was then spread throughout the globe during the colonial period. And with a bit of reflection, it appears that this narrative, intentionally or not, has been deeply embedded within the global rangeland community. And I view this as being evidenced by very restrictive rangeland definitions, misunderstanding of pastoralism that continues today, the need for rangeland development programs, rangeland omission from the structure of intergovernmental organizations. You have a look at those organizations, and agriculture, forestry, and livestock are all very prominent. Rangelands are all but absent. Now, we're in a position to address rapidly accelerating challenges. We need to reach beyond our comfort zone, and that's certainly true for me regarding narratives in the profession by and large, as poorly prepared to deal with these types of issues. But the scholars that work with this topic indicate that narratives represent the default mode of human thought. So they are approximations of how humans interact with nature, and their legitimacy is based on the appearance of truth. Or another way to think about narratives is they provide meaning to real world events without specific argument or evidence. So consequently, narratives are very difficult to counter with facts and evidence. And with a bit of thought, we can think of many examples. To demonstrate the power of narratives, I'd like to contrast a narrative of the Dust Bowl with a historical chronicle of the Dust Bowl. So the chronicle goes, immigrants encouraged to settle the Great Plains in 1862 and 1909 due to some homestead acts. Agriculture flourished during the 1920s due to favorable weather and high grain prices. However, a consecutive 7-year drought produced massive human exodus from the plains in the 1930s. However, the region was repopulated with government support in the 1940s. Concise, accurate, factual, not particularly compelling. Here would be a Dust Bowl narrative from Cronin. Drought on the plains was a formidable antagonist to the advance of civilization, but perseverance and ingenuity ensured human triumph. Wow. The narrative provides the plot for a compelling interpretation of events, very compelling. It's clearly human-centric, and it discounts a large number of discontinuities or inconsistencies, primarily the ignorance and greed of humans that contributed to the Dust Bowl itself. Now, you might be wondering, why place such emphasis on narratives? Why not just take the traditional approach of educating the public? That's because it's becoming increasingly clear that facts or evidence alone is not sufficient to change hearts, minds, and attitudes. In other words, the presentation of facts or evidence by several different venues is not necessarily going to change individual attitudes. So this is nicely substantiated by Thomas Heberlein in a quite widely distributed book published in 2012, where he describes human attitudes as a disposition towards a topic or issue. And these attitudes are made up of two distinct components. One is the belief component, and it's object specific without emotion. The effect is a much more emotional and can be an irrational component. So in terms of belief regarding the COVID virus, COVID is a biological virus that's readily transmitted among humans. The effect comes into play when we ask, how do we manage as a species to deal with this particular biological virus? And we see a number of irrational types of expressions emerging. Unfortunately, the effect is stronger than belief, so evidence alone does not change attitude. This effect is strongest when it's based on identity and experience, or sort of a cultural identity. And here I'm suggesting that narratives may be another solution, along with education, to place a more positive perspective on rangelands. A friend and colleague, Brandon Vestermeyer, said a couple of years ago, the only way to counter a negative narrative is with a positive narrative. And on a bit of reflection, that's a pretty common phenomenon. There's been a counter narrative to the balance of nature that's being developed, or has been developed, within the ecological discipline of the past 5 decades. So non-equilibrium is now much more widely referenced than is equilibrium. More recently, there's a narrative of the good Anthropocene that's being developed to counter a narrative of a dystopian future. So the initiative of the seeds of a good Anthropocene has been emerging this past decade. So the challenge to us is, how do we come up with a effective set of counter narratives? And I'm as confused as these two individuals. And clearly we could benefit from the help of expertise in science communication. I am simply throwing out here, for purposes of discussion, 4 approaches or themes to how we might deal with development of a counter narrative. We could look at a more encompassing definition, cultural diversity of pastoral societies, a more complete accounting of ecosystem services. And we need to be sure and emphasize the planetary scale, given that rangelands are the largest cover type on land. So in terms of definitions, here's a definition from a widely used range management textbook: uncultivated land that provides the necessities of life for grazing and browsing animals. From FAO, an area where wild and domestic animals graze or browse on uncultivated vegetation. Very restrictive and uninspiring. Here would be perhaps a more inclusive definition: human-dominated ecosystems supporting native or naturalized vegetation, managed as complex adaptive systems to provision multiple ecosystem services to benefit human well-being. A powerful narrative needs to be human-centric. We could place emphasis on the development of pastoralism as a component of modern human society. So pastoralism apparently originated at the end of the Pleistocene and existed throughout the Holocene. An important aspect of that is that one of the Pleistocene megafauna, the aurochs, were domesticated as one of the forms of currently domesticated cattle. There's a large number of pastoralists, however, they're variable and not particularly well defined. And there appears to be some 50 or so major pastoral societies that exist that have unique cultures, customs, and dialects that could be recognized and celebrated to a much greater extent. We could place much greater emphasis on a complete accounting of the ecosystem services provided by rangelands. What we have done, by and large, is focus on only the provisioning category of ecosystem services. And even there, we've tended to focus on forage and livestock primarily, while overlooking the vast contribution of supporting services, regulating services, and cultural services, all of those valuable to not only residents of rangelands, but the global population at large. In terms of ecosystem services, biodiversity is thought to be the foundation for all of these services. And a paper published in 2009 demonstrated that the greatest threat to safe operating spaces for humanity on the planet was the rapid loss of biodiversity. Well, it's been estimated that some 35% of the land area is ecologically intact. And let's take that to mean extensively managed, about 14% of that area protected. As I mentioned previously, rangelands are about 54% of the total land area, with about 12% protected. So the point here is, of the ecologically intact land that's capable of providing or supporting biodiversity, rich biodiversity, and diverse ecosystem services, rangelands are a large component of that total land area. Now, here's just a couple of examples of narratives I've come up with. This marginalization narrative is directly from Diana Davis. Global rangelands were initially forested, but indigenous peoples degraded them, contributing to extensive rangelands characterized by resource scarcity and variability. A counter narrative might look something like the following: rapid biodiversity loss imperils planetary function, but the vast biodiversity of expansive heterogeneous rangelands can maintain a safe operating space for humanity. We're demonstrating the tremendous value of global rangelands to not only the residents of rangelands, but all of humanity. So in closing, I would just like to re-emphasize that the power of a strong counter-narrative or narratives emphasizing rangeland value to planetary stewardship cannot be overemphasized. Some of the implications could be transformation of one or more intergovernmental organizations associated with rangelands, justify greater societal support for rangeland biodiversity, empower pastoralists with greater self-governance by demonstrating the tremendous value of rangelands. In fact, a series of counter-narratives could be a signature contribution of the International Year of Rangelands and Pastoralists that may have far-reaching consequences. I look forward to your comments in the subsequent panel discussion.